Welcome to Case by Case. This is a podcast brought to you by Callum Chain and Luke Zadkovich. Hey Callum, how are you today?
I'm very good, Luke. How are you doing?
I'm very well. We're moving into cruise territory, as in cruise ship territory today with today's podcast. Judgment given by our favourite Lord Justice Males. I say that tongue-in-cheek, of course, but if for anyone who's been a long-time listener of the podcast, you will know that Callum and I have set up the unofficial Lord Justice Males fan club. And I think it's fair to say this is another classic that we have on our hands today, Callum.
It's a classic in the sense that it's a wonderfully written judgment, first and foremost. And it really takes you through the issues. It tells the story extremely clearly and comes to a very lucid conclusion, which is different to the courts beneath it in the way that it's written. Just feels so self-evident and obvious that it's almost, how could the other courts possibly have not come to this conclusion? I think belies the fact that it's a very complex question with a bunch of evidence, a number of different claims being thrown around. So it's classic in the sense that it is Lord Justice Males on, as ever, top form, but it's also classic because it's a bit of an interesting case, this one. It's a couple who went on a cruise, the Shermans. The cruise left a lot to be desired, in their opinion, and they wanted their money back. It's this long battle between the Shermans and the travel agents to try and recover the cost of this Arctic cruise and trying to work out whether or not they're entitled to.
Yeah, well, there's a lot in there, and let's come on to the facts of this case. It makes for a fascinating discussion, the background and the outcome and the journey that the parties have been through the courts. But before we do, I don't want to get off Lord Justice Males. I have a prediction to make, Callum, and it's reading judgments like these that make me say this, as well as all the other, judgments we've read, which are on very complex, complicated matters with a lot of money at stake. This is not necessarily one of those. It's interesting in other ways. But my prediction is that we are going to be reading one day of Males' decisions from the Supreme Court. And for not the first time, I've read one of his judgments. And this is absolutely meant with no disrespect to any of the courts that have dealt with the issues below the Court of Appeal in this instance. Lord Justice Males comes to a view that none of the courts below had, and all for different reasons comes to a decision. And when you then see it set out in that way, it's, as you just said then, it's like, of course, yes, that is the way through this issue. And it's not how the High Court have dealt with it before, or the arbitrator or what have you. Sometimes it is, and he does it with such deference and respect for other judges that have dealt with the matters and viewed it. But there's just that clarity of thought, if I can put it like that, and expression and getting to the nub of issues. And this is one where to say that a deft hand was required would be a bit of an understatement, because you had unrepresented litigants here that actually made some quite compelling arguments. Some other claims they ran at first instance, which had allegations of bad faith, were not substantiated, to put it lightly, and there's some criticism made of that in this judgment. But the way that the court here has handled the issues, handled the toing and froing on decisions below, come to a clear outcome, and then recognising that the claimants, respondents on the appeal, the Shermans, recognising that they are still unrepresented, and yet this case involving, a cruise of about £20,000 has occupied 10 days of court time, including a few in the Court of Appeal. There's then this instruction at the end of the judgment, almost like a blueprint for how the party should go away and try and resolve this case and be done with it. It's just, I just think it's a masterclass. It really is, and I say that with the greatest respect.
It's funny where you see these masterclasses, because it's not, as you say, it's not in a dispute worth tens of millions of pounds that's turning on some highly bespoke negotiated contract. It's actually the far more complex and fiddly attempt to unpick booking confirmation from EU regulations, from terms and conditions housed on a website, all in the context of this, in terms of the size of dispute that the Court of Appeal regularly sees, very small contract. But obviously in terms of what it means to the Shermans, a substantial sum of money. £20,000 is a serious sum to an individual. So you can see kind of why it's been pursued by those individuals so aggressively to try and get their money back. And at the same time, you can see the court's frustration with, this is taking up a lot of resource, a lot of court time, dealt with the utmost kind of respect and deference to the courts below, and to the people involved, and kind of setting out at the end this blueprint for, whether it's a blueprint for settlement or alternatively a blueprint for the court to which this decision has been sent back for a final evaluation. It is, as you say, a masterclass.
Yeah, I don't mean to suggest that this is a straightforward case on contract formation, because it is all over the place, frankly. And that's just a creature of how the parties form the contract here. And perhaps we should get into that as our first step. Even in the way that these holidays are booked, this was an unusual one because it kind of came out of a prior trip that they were told about by a friend, and it was done over the phone. The phone call was recorded, which was curious. So they had the actual transcript of the call to use. Some documents were sent after the call, and then there was the final invoice that was sent. And let's get into that, I suppose, and give a bit more detail on it. But it's not clear. It's not easy to say, well, that's exactly where the contract was formed on. It is a bit, well, it could be this day, it could be that day. They kind of agreed on the phone, but then they sent this more information after that, and then the formal invoice came through. And when you then read the decision of the Court of Appeal, it's like, of course, yes, that is, I think, the right answer.
The two passengers were Mrs. Rosemary Sherman and Mr. Nicholas Sherman. And I reflected that this was, although a terrible cruise experience for Mrs. Rosemary Sherman, it was not the worst experience someone called Rose has had on a cruise ship in the North Atlantic. One for our Titanic fans.
There's been a debate on that, hasn't there? And I can't let it pass without commenting on it. Was the piece of driftwood or whatever it was it big enough for Jack to get on as well?
There was definitely space on that piece of driftwood. I'd be interested to hear what Lord Justice Mills has to say on that one. So the Shermans were on an Antarctic cruise the year before, where they met some friends, and their friends said, we're going on this great Arctic cruise next year. And the Arctic cruise was through the Northwest Passage, and it was called the Northwest Passage in the wake of the great explorers. A number of our listeners will know that there's a great exploring history and tradition with the Northwest Passage. There are a number of iconic landmarks and stop-off points on the way through the Northwest Passage that people can go to on cruises to see the area and to kind of walk in the steps of some of that history. Because the Shermans were aware of this cruise, they phoned up these travel agents. I don't know if they were strictly travel agents or performing a different service here.
Callum, before you get into the call, did you pick up that, and I thought this was just a nice by the by, that the trip was of immediate interest to Mr. and Mrs. Sherman, not least because Mrs. Sherman originates from Canada, while Sherman Inlet in Nunavut is named after an ancestor of Mr. Sherman.
I liked that a lot, but that was a nice personal touch, and in a way, it goes to presumably immeasurable disappointment that the couple faced when the tour ended up being a shadow of what was intended, because they did have all this personal connection, and it sounded like a great trip. So they then phone up rather than booking through a catalog or looking online and selecting a cruise that way. They then phone up this company who has previously put them on cruises to the Antarctic, and they say, "Hey, we've heard about this cruise, this Northwest Passage cruise. Is this something that you run? Would you be able to do it? We've heard there's a cruise going with this vessel around this time." The company say, "Well, we'll take it away and we'll get back to you." The company then get back to them and say, "Okay, this is the price. This is what you get for that price. This is the flights that it includes, in and out of Montreal." There was a bit of an exchange about, okay, well, we don't actually need the flights because we will be making an earlier flight ourselves. As you say, Luke, there's some family interest, so they're going off to see their family first for a little bit. There's all these kind of discussions around how the trip is going to shape up. But none of the discussions, crucially, are talking about a detailed itinerary once on board the cruise ship. After this phone call, there's then a initial booking summary. The initial booking summary sets out a number of points, and actually gets a number of them wrong. It's maybe a 15-line summary. The cost is wrong. There are a few other issues with the initial summary. There is then a further message after the initial summary, which is a confirmation document. And the confirmation document, I think it was maybe called the confirmation invoice, attached a travel itinerary. That was the first time. This was, I think it was 12 days after the initial booking summary was sent. For the first time, do they see the full detailed itinerary in a confirmation from ROL, who are these travel agents?
Just pausing there. Okay. So just to recap that. So the 3 steps we have here, I think it's fair to say, 9th of January, we have the phone calls. Next day, the 10th of January, we have the booking summary that goes out with other terms and conditions and documents. Then we have 12 days later, the confirmation and importantly, the invoice, the confirmation invoice. And it's that invoice that contains reference to the detailed itinerary. Phone call, documents go out the next day, and then 12 days later, on the 22nd of January, we then have this confirmation invoice with the detailed itinerary.
Going back to that phone call, one of the really key ones is that the salesperson says, I'll just remind you, once it's booked and confirmed, you will be committed to going. The deposit is a non-refundable amount. Obviously, once it has gone through, you will be bound by the terms and conditions of the cruise liner and the sales agent's terms and conditions, once again, which you will receive along with your documentation. And Mrs. Sherman says, great, yeah, okie dokie. The real question in all of this is, at what point is the contract properly formed? And it's a really interesting question because you have this phone call where there's this suggestion of a non-refundable amount of someone being committed to going on the trip. You've got what seems like a assent to that of great, yeah, okie dokie. And then the next day you've got a booking summary which is sent, which is in some respects in line with the conversation, but has some errors. And then you also have the payment of a deposit. As you read through the judgment, it becomes clear this correspondence alone doesn't actually give you all the information that you need to find when a contract was formed, because you also have to look to regulations that regulate the provision of this kind of service.
And so it's this question, the cruise company was arguing that the contract was formed either in the phone call on the 9th or when the documents were sent with the booking summary the next day, so on the 9th or the 10th. On either scenario, they would say that was the contract and it then did not include this detailed itinerary. And of course, the reason the detailed itinerary is important is because what ultimately happened here is that when the Shermans and some others who decided to go ahead with the voyage, it didn't call at a number of the Canadian stop-offs or viewpoints that was billed in some of the brochures and information that the Shermans had signed up for. So they didn't get the voyage that they were hoping for and expecting. That was because there was more ice that year than there had been in the decade prior. It was unexpected, but still foreseeable. There's a discussion later around, whether force majeure comes into it and all of that. But for present purposes, the upshot is that the Shermans didn't get to have the voyage that they were expecting because the vessel couldn't call at some of the Canadian ports. And so going back to contract formation, it was really critical as to whether the detailed itinerary formed part of the essential terms of the contract. That was a point that was not easily resolved down below in the other courts, and was the issue that was before the Court of Appeal here. And so if the Shermans were right in saying that the contract was not formed until the 22nd of January when the confirmation invoice was sent, then that allowed them to pull in the reference to the detailed itinerary and say, look, it was an essential part of this contract we entered into that the vessel would call at XYZ ports in Canada, or at least sail by these places so that they could be viewed from the cruise ship. Yeah, you've got this debate about when the contract was formed.
And that leads us nicely onto the regulation. And there's a 1992 regulation that governs package holidays. And Regulation 9 of that 1992 regulation is the key one here, which talks about the person selling the package holiday has to ensure that, and this is Regulation 9.1b, subject to paragraph 2 below, all the terms of the contract are set out in writing or such other form as is comprehensible and accessible to the consumer and are communicated to the consumer before the contract is made. I think actually, sorry, I've got the wrong clause there. The key one is Regulation 9.1a, which says the person selling the package tour shall ensure that depending on the nature of the package being purchased, the contract contains at least the elements specified in Schedule 2 to these regulations. and it's scheduled 2, you get the itinerary. And so then there's this question, because if it was the case, and I think as you read through the facts, the way that we would normally look at formation of contract, you could say, well, there is an agreement on terms at the stage at which there is this booking confirmation sent, or the I can't remember exactly what the terminology was that's used in the message, the booking summary. Because you have this discussion on the phone, there seems to be an agreement, then you get a booking summary, then you get a deposit paid. That seems to tick a number of boxes of what is needed to form a contract under English law, except for in this special case of a package tour, you also do need the itinerary. And although the booking summary said there was a box for destination, which said Northwest Passage in the wake of the Great Explorers, that was not held to be sufficient to be an itinerary. An itinerary would need to tell you more. It would need to tell you exactly where you're going, as this later booking confirmation did.
There's a lot in there, and we could get into the depths of travel law here. It does make for an interesting case. And look, if you're in the cruise industry and have been hotly following this case, there is more in this decision, I think, to look at what can and can't be done in terms and conditions or in brochures to mitigate an outcome like this case. One of the comments made by Lord Justice Underhill was to that effect, that there was actually some language in the brochure here that wasn't enough to change the outcome in this case, which we'll come on to in a minute. But that's not to say that different language could not be used. So there is more to look at here if you are a cruise operator and you're looking at how to deal with this potential scenario happening in the language that you're using in your brochures and other documents. But the main issue here was, as we've said, when was the contract formed? And where the court went to was to look at what did the terms and conditions that was sent to the Shermans, what did they actually say? There was a lot of focus on the commercial invoice in those terms and conditions, and that really the contract doesn't come into existence until they issue the confirmation invoice. Now, there was a debate about what is the confirmation invoice in this instance. Was it that booking summary, or was it the actual invoice that came those 12 days later that included the reference to the detailed itinerary? When you look at the actual language of the terms and conditions of the cruise operator, a plain reading of those would seem to suggest that it wasn't until the invoice was sent. And now there was this debate about, well, we only have to issue an invoice internally or something. And Lord Justice Mayles is like, no. The invoice has to be sent to the customer. The terms and conditions kind of reflect that. That was one of the key points on this contract formation issue and why it went in favour of the Shermans.
And I think another point which was quite interesting, and this is why right at the start I made the point that these negotiations happened over the phone through a recommendation from a friend rather than through a brochure or through an online platform. If, as was held in the courts below, the contract was formed on the basis of, the earlier exchanges, the phone call and the order summary, the effect would be that of all the people on board this cruise ship, Mr. and Mrs. Sherman had actually signed up for a different thing than the rest of the passengers. Because of the way in which they'd signed up for it, the contract they'd entered into would be materially different to all the other customers who had basically bought and paid for ostensibly the same thing. And I think this is, when I was reading the judgment, we talked at length at the top of the podcast about the kind of lucidity and readability and I guess the naturalness of the way that Lord Justice Mayles comes to a conclusion on this point. But for me, that was a very important part of it, was to recognize that really what's being sold here is a consumer product, and it would be very odd if the manner in which that consumer product was sold meant that you had an entirely different product being sold to two people on the same cruise.
Did you have any other comments to make on formation of the contract?
The only thing I would say is that the reason it matters here, if there's a departure from the contract, then certain rights kick in. And I think we'll probably go on to what those rights are and how this would have been formed. The reason it's so critical is that there are certain rights that a consumer has if a package holiday is changed from the original itinerary. And if the original itinerary was simply saying Northwest Passage Tour, then that wouldn't necessarily have been a fundamental change, because they were still broadly speaking, touching into the Northwest Passage. If the terms that bound the contract were the more specific terms that were later sent, obviously the significant change to the itinerary, or you would meet the threshold of having this fundamental change to the itinerary. So that's why it was such a critical point.
The ultimate decision here was that on the 9th of January, at the time of that phone call, the Shermans had not concluded the contract in that call. They were expecting to conclude, but they had not concluded. And even though the sales person there had used this wording, once it's booked and confirmed, you will be committed to going, and that once it has gone through, that still require the documents to be sent to the Shermans. They hadn't seen the terms and conditions at this stage. So they would have almost been committing to going blind, as it's put. And I think that's fair, right? From a consumer perspective, you can see why the court set it out that way. And then when the terms and conditions were received, those conditions made clear that the contract was not binding until the commercial invoice was sent. And it's in the commercial invoice that you then get this reference to the detailed itinerary. And going back to an earlier point I made, just because there was an itinerary included doesn't mean that it always will form an essential part of the contract. It does depend on how the itinerary is sent out. It does depend on what language is used in that, what's understood by the voyage. You can see that if you're a cruise operator reflecting on this decision, that you'll be going through the language used with a very fine-tooth comb, and actually probably going through some training with your sales assistants to say, look, there's no point trying to lock in the sale on a phone call before certain terms and conditions have been sent to them, because it's not going to be binding. And yes, you've got to lock in a sale, and I get all that from a sales perspective. But actually, you might be making a rod for your own back if you haven't put the terms and conditions before the customer at the time they're actually agreeing. So, yeah, if we have some cruise operators that want to get some advice on this, I'd be happy to kind of guide you through it. But yeah, so anything else on this? There's then the effect of this, I suppose, whether this was a minor or a major alteration. It seemed pretty clear cut that it was a major change, and that the voyage that ultimately went ahead was significantly different to what had gone before. And that's important because in the terms and conditions, there's this distinction between what happens in the event of a minor change, when the customer is compensated to an equivalent amount for a minor change, compared with a major alteration where they're essentially offered a refund if they want to. And in that whole discussion, there's this helpful passage around, and this goes to the regulations you mentioned earlier, when a cruise operator like this needs to inform its customers of those changes. And if they sit on changes and don't tell customers that things are happening, like has happened here, where they found out that the ice conditions weren't great, and customers may have been able to change their plans, not get on the vessel, rearrange things, even if they're halfway through their travel. You've got to get out there and inform your customers as to what's happening. That's effectively the upshot of it.
Yeah, I think maybe the last kind of interesting legal point is that this all then gets remitted back to the county court. It's not a case of the Court of Appeal comes to a final decision. The Court of Appeal gives its guidance to the county court, and in this case, as you said at the start, gives pretty strong guidance around this is basically the framework within which you can now make your decision about who's getting paid and how much, but also really being clear, this is not another opportunity for general complaints about the cruise. This is a very, there remain only a very narrow set of questions that can be asked and answered.
The last 2 pages of this judgment are worth reading for any practitioners out there, or indeed any litigants in person that are considering bringing claims. It's very instructive to the parties in this matter, I think, broadly as well, to others. And the court is walking a tightrope here, because a litigant in person is entitled to be heard before the courts. they've actually done really well here in some respects. They've beaten a cruise operator with lawyers on the other side. I want to say, a KC and junior barrister appearing for the cruise company. And Mr. and Mrs. Sherman have prevailed ultimately here. Yet, that said, there were some, let's say, missteps along the way in their allegations about bad food and what have you were not accepted. But most importantly, they ran allegations of bad faith, misrepresentation, and I can't remember the other ones, but essentially deceit, as we know as lawyers, quite elevated allegations to be made requiring a showing of bad faith. And you need convincing evidence to do that. And the Court of Appeal here frowned upon that. And the reason they made that quite clear here, I suspect, I don't know, but I suspect, is that the court is encouraging the parties to try and resolve this. And the Shermans, whether they realise it or not, may well have some cost exposure, because by running arguments that failed and arguments that were probably always bound to fail, given the evidence, they potentially have adverse cost exposure here. And in a case where your claim is in the 20,000 to, I don't know, add some on for some of the other points they're claiming here, maybe 30, 40,000, that can quickly be outweighed by adverse cost risk for a KC on having to deal with allegations of bad faith, which shouldn't have been run in the first place. So there's a bit there where the court's saying, look, litigants in person, get some advice on this, because you've had your days in court, and there's all the comments there about proportionality. It's not all in one direction on this, and so there's good reason to try and resolve this. And it's difficult for a court to say that, right? It's, and I think they've done such a great job here, if I can say that, of navigating through, giving litigants in person their day in court, coming to the decision they did, trying to deal with proportionality, and then giving it a steer so this matter can hopefully get resolved one way or another more quickly by the county court on remission, or hopefully in some kind of resolution.
Ultimately, the reason that people end up in court is that they haven't found a middle ground. They haven't found a reason to settle. So, it's not always through absence of trying. And often at the end of a hearing, you see the offer where you go, oh, actually, there was a very sensible offer made along early in the proceedings. But at the same time, it seems like a lot of the additional use of court time in this case was, as you say, run on cases that had pretty flimsy grounds. Certainly that there wasn't probably enough evidence really to be running. Yeah, despite all that, you still have these litigants in person who have managed to do a pretty phenomenal job against very serious legal opposition.
Yeah, I think the last paragraph of Lord Justice Underhill sums this up. Mr. and Mrs. Sherman, who have succeeded in this case on a far more limited basis than that which they initially advanced, okay, that's those allegations of bad faith, need to consider carefully what Lord Justice Mayles has said about the basis on which compensation would be assessed. They have so far chosen to represent themselves, though I should recall that the court expressly drew their attention in advance of the hearing of this appeal to the possible availability of pro bono representation. So it's free representation. But they may feel that the time has come when they would benefit from professional legal advice, whether or not in the context of a mediation process, as Lady Justice Asplin suggests. Some pretty, clear wording there for the claimants, respondents to reflect upon. I really enjoyed this one, Callan. This was one that I'm not sure what my expectations were heading into it. For not the first time, I came away reading one of Lord Justice Mayles' decisions saying, that with a bit of a wry smile, with a bit of it's another good one.
Yeah, me too. I enjoyed that. It's always a sector that we know well, but it's not a specific issue that we're likely to come across too often in our day-to-day job. So it's a very interesting one to read through.
All right, everyone. Thank you for listening in. We hope you've enjoyed that too. And until next time, take care. This is Case by Case.
See you next time. Later.